It's great to have you joining me today, Andrew and Niamh. Thanks for being on the show today. Maybe worth saying right at the outset that very often on this show, when I bring people together to discuss science, faith and evolution, it's quite often a conversation perhaps between someone who does believe in the evolutionary story, someone maybe who has questions or is skeptical of it. What we're doing today, obviously, is two people who are both perfectly content with the evolutionary story and record in history, but who perhaps have some interesting insights from two different perspectives on how it matches with the Bible. And Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all. How long have you been involved in science, evolution, and that kind of thing?
Since about 1990, yes. So I worked on the biology of colour and vision in nature. And in particular, I got interested in how the eye evolved. But also colour. I mean, the colours that you have in nature are just amazing. It turns out that they involve very, very intricate nanotechnology. Just animals and plants have evolved these amazing technologies to produce the brightest colours that exist. And these are actually technologies that they're physical structures. So they're not like pigments that you get in our clothes or in paints. They are like microstructures. So they can actually show up in fossils. And that's where this all started for me, because although we had all these range of animals and plants where we could put them into electron microscopes and see the structures and then predict what colours, well, fossils began to turn up with these structures as well. Now, we have this situation on Earth today where you've got vision and you've got colour. And vision is the most powerful sense on Earth. But, there's this arms race going on, animals and plants altering or evolving their colours in response to the eye, and then the eye evolves in response to that. So I was wondering, how long has this situation been going on for? Well, we found fossils that were 515 million years old that still had these microstructures producing colour. So animals at that time would have been coloured too. So I thought, well, that's how much further can we extend that? That's going pretty far back.
Colour goes back a long, long way.
That's right. Well, then it came obvious to me that the answer to that is the moment the first eye evolved. Because without eyes, there was no such thing as colour. So animals wouldn't have been evolving clever colour strategies without any vision.
Sure.
And so I thought, well, I'll have a look to see when the first eye evolved. And so I went through the fossil record, because eyes are comparatively large, so they show up well in the fossil record. And the first ones I found were 521 million years ago, which was a trilobite. And this was quite significant because it was just prior to an event called the Cambrian explosion.
Yes,
That's right.
We talked about that on this show.
Okay,
before.
the Big Bang of evolution. Now, we didn't know what was the cause of that. We had various explanations like oxygen levels and carbon dioxide levels suddenly changing. But they'd been changing on and off continuously over time. Now, if you suddenly throw the most powerful organ or introduce the most powerful stimulus of all into the behaviour of animals, sight and vision, it's going to create chaos in evolutionary terms. Everything's going to suddenly have to adapt. All of a sudden, there's a predator on the scene, looking out at the world and can instantly identify everything around it and assess its capabilities and know whether it can eat it. And these animals around it were just exposed as chunks of protein. So although they belong to different evolutionary groups, they were all sort of in a soft body like that of a worm. But the advent of vision suddenly meant that they went into evolutionary overdrive and evolved all sorts of mechanisms to protect themselves against these predators. Coloration, hard parts, so that if anything looking at it could see a ball of spikes and would be put off. Or they could have fleet forms, so they could escape quickly. They evolved hard parts.
It is an extraordinary thing, and we've actually debated the Cambrian explosion in the past. But your theory is that it was sight that essentially triggered, if you like, this sudden explosion of new body plans and all kinds of new types of creatures that suddenly appear in the fossil record.
That's right. Not the new body plans themselves. They were already around, but all the groups that already had those different body plans still all had a soft body, and evolution was slow, relatively. So, but they all took out on their characteristic forms.
I mean, this is the big insight you're famous for, but it's also plays into this book you wrote, The Genesis Enigma, Why the Bible is Scientifically Accurate. Tell us about how that particular insight fits into the 6-day story of creation that we find in Genesis.
That's right. So after I published my book on that in the blink of an eye, I had lots of letters and people approaching me saying, what you've got here is the answer to Genesis. And, no, I'm not religious. I'm agnostic, so I'm sort of very interested in people's opinions on that. I don't discount it. So I looked into it, and actually with some friends from the Royal Society, we sat down and we planned everything out and thought, well, actually, that's it. That's the sort of the let there be light bit. And then you have the sea creatures following, and it all sort of
so
was interesting.
Just for those who don't have it off the top of their head, you've obviously got day one, God says, let there be light. There's a kind of the beginning act of things coming into being.
Yes.
And then you've got the water on day two. Okay. Then I think it talks about there being grass and sort of vegetation and that kind of thing on day 3. Day 4, it says God separated lights in the sky. God separated the day from the night. Now most people think, who might be skeptical of whether this account matches any kind of evolutionary record, would say, well, hang on, if the sun appears on day 4. What does it even make sense to talk about days up to that point? But your point was that actually this day 4 is actually could be taken as when animals start seeing, so they can see, so light becomes, if you like, accessible.
That's right. Yes. So you have the introduction of the sun at the very beginning, as the let there be light. But then, after the events that actually did happen in evolutionary history, we've got this other one now, which is the evolution of vision. So it's interesting to me. I mean, I don't really know how to interpret it, but you do have this interesting thing going on where there is an account in Genesis that does seem to match the scientific story.
Because after that, you obviously then have the animals in the sea, birds in the sky, and animals on the land, and humans eventually at the end of all that. And as far as you're concerned, that, broadly speaking, does match the way in which things progressed on an evolutionary front, if you like.
That's right. Yes. It does seem it seems a good match, but that's okay. It's a fairly broad match, But there's a few interesting things I thought, which was the singling out the sea creatures that people who were sort of landlocked wherever they were writing should pick out sea creatures and the diversity of sea creatures. And at that time, life was exclusively marine. So it was all about these obscure groups of sea creatures that we don't really know today. Very not in general terms.
I mean, we could skip around in the different days in that account. I know that I think the way that you interpret for your sort of account of how this happened, the day 3 and the vegetation and so on, you'd see as being in the evolutionary account about photosynthesis developing. That had to be there at that early stage.
That's right.
The other parts of the natural record to come about. It's a fascinating hypothesis. The question it leaves me, I suppose, Andrew, is what, did it bring you to any sort of conclusions? I mean, did you think, well, just an incredibly lucky guess by these, people writing this record 3,000 years ago, or did you think maybe there is a divine hand behind this creation account, given how closely it seems to map onto the historical record of Earth?
That's right. I mean, just like with my view on religion, really, I didn't know.
Right.
So I thought, well, maybe it's fair to actually put out both accounts out there, really.
And that was it.
Yes.
And to this day, you I think still happy to wear the label agnostic. So you've obviously not something that's convinced you at this point of the existence of God or any particular religion, but
not particularly. But there's there are things I find interesting that shouldn't be immediately discounted. I think things in religion such as sort of why is there something rather than nothing. But the general thing about why this book, the Bible, has stuck around, I think is quite interesting. Where other books have fallen away through time. But there are some things there that just seem intriguing.
Right. Well, it's good to hear that you're quite open-minded on this, because it's probably fair to say that some of your biological colleagues, naming no names, are less open-minded as to whether the Bible has anything useful to tell us 2,000 years later. But fascinating stuff. I know there's a new book on the way as well on consciousness, I think.
That involves consciousness,
right,
yes, actually.
Another
it's
fascinating, mysterious area.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that's obviously... This new book is not about religion, but it could be... Somebody could look into it from that perspective.
I'm sure. I mean, it raises all kinds of metaphysical questions, I suppose, the consciousness issue.
Oh, yeah.
Welcome along to the programme. Also, Niamh, great to have you with us. It was really your book that sparked me wanting to bring you both together and realising there was some overlap with what Andrew has also written with what you've done. Homolapsus, Sin, Evolution and the God Who Is Love. I think intentionally taking... picking up on that well-known book by Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens and Homo Deus, his most recent. Tell us a little bit about who he is and what he's written and how your work interacts with that.
Well, Yuval Noah Harari, he understands, how crucial it is that to understand how we evolved and how our behaviour evolved. That understanding that can help us in the future not to make the same mistakes again, particularly with the rapid technological progress. Things are moving on so quickly that we could really end up in an awful dystopian future. I mean, he mentions extinction, but he also he says something like, we now have kind of the surveillance technology that could make Stalin and all those, nothing,
Right.
And that humans could become redundant, or you could have master races, you could have all kinds of, awful things. And that knowing how we evolved, as he said, we could have classes of people that would be like Neanderthals were to Homo sapiens, that's what could happen. And I totally agree with that evolution, how we evolved, is crucial to understanding human nature, and also how to move forward and use science. Science has the power to do catastrophic harm or great good. I mean, it's, scientific technology enabled the First World War and the Second World War and the Holocaust. Without the technology, they couldn't have happened. So, but science also has the power and has done great good and can do great good. So it's to make sure that we end up not in a dystopian future, that we use the technology for the best. Now, where we would disagree is he thinks politics and culture can do it. I'm saying, yes, we do need, obviously, politics and culture, but we need grace.
Right.
That, in fact, what he's describing, it helps you to understand why the Gospels are good news, because we're not just stuck with trying to do politics or that we have grace.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously where your book comes in, Niamh. Now, it was interesting, before we came on air, you described Andrew as a scientist dabbling in theology and yourself as a theologian dabbling in science. And the book is extraordinarily comprehensive and very detailed in bringing us, the evolutionary history of early hominids and humans ultimately, and giving a really helpful sketch as well of where Darwin and others who were developing evolutionary theory at the time, what they said about the relationship between God, science and faith as these theories were coming to the fore. Perhaps most interestingly, it's not often well known that there was a contemporary of Darwin's who sort of came upon evolution at the same time as him. And you think his story has not really been told all that much.
Alfred Russel Wallace, yeah. Because of the conflict that was developing at the time between religion and science, Wallace was kind of suppressed. But Wallace discovered natural selection at the same time as Darwin. He was actually out in the Amazon and Malaysia and so on.
And they corresponded
and they were writing to each other. And Darwin was urged, you better publish because he'll get there before you. But the thing was that the interesting thing was that Darwin had been going to be an Anglican clergyman. But when he saw the way natural selection impacted on human nature, he felt that a rational species like us was bound to become calculatedly aggressive and competitively aggressive and greedy and deceitful and so on. So he then doubted the God of Christianity. He became an agnostic because he said, the all good, all powerful God of Christianity, how can you say that he's all good and that gets... But interestingly, Wallace, who was a communist and an atheist. He loved nature, and he found a God in nature, that was completely different to the God he was brought up with. But he became convinced that natural selection could not have produced human cognitive and spiritual faculties. He said natural selection could have produced something like a Neanderthal, like a highly intelligent ape, but it couldn't have produced our cognitive and spiritual faculties. So he said there must have been divine intervention in the evolutionary process, and he felt that was science, that it was just as scientific as discovering natural selection to say what natural selection couldn't have achieved.
That's really remarkable.
He was saying that was science as well.
So Alfred Russel Wallace, essentially, who co-discovered really evolution alongside Darwin, but took a very different approach to it in terms of the theological implications of that. For Darwin, it obviously led to this rejecting the Christian God. For Wallace, it spoke to him that there must be some kind of a divine imprint.
And he thought it was a benign God. He loved nature. He thought this was wonderful. He felt he would have called the exhilarating God of natural selection. He thought that,
we're going to have to skip through a lot of this because it's done in great detail in the book. But essentially, you take us on a sort of whistle-stop tour through the various sort of different types of hominids in evolutionary history up to humans. And the key point for you is that there are certain moments in that where it seems for you have to have some sort of a divine activity going on to make sense of the leaps that happen in cognitive, social, moral sort of ability that's going on. Can you kind of pinpoint sort of where that happens for you in the evolutionary record, and why you think it's necessary at that point to say something more than just natural selection is going on at this point?
Well, there is a phenomenon in evolutionary biology and paleoanthropology particularly called the cognitive revolution, or the Great Leap Forward, that there was a punctuated event, a sudden event, whereby all of our special attributes came as a package, like our artistic abilities, our musical abilities, symbolic language, great, improving technology all the time, like great technology. It all seemed to arrive at once.
Almost like the Cambrian explosion brought out all these new species.
It was a Cambrian explosion in cognitional abilities. Now, you see, what's known now is that everybody who lives outside Africa is descended from one small group that left around, they think, 60,000 years ago. And the fossil record in Europe shows that. Now, however, the fossil record in Africa, all those things were there in Africa as well. They found they're found between 70,000 and 90,000 years ago, although sometimes it's moving back a bit. There seems to have been something in Eurasia that facilitated cultural transmission. So you got, but whatever happened in Africa. So far, anyway, that's what the scholarly consensus at the moment is. But it happened very suddenly. Now, Darwinian evolution is gradualistic, very slow. There's another type of evolution called punctuated equilibrium, which doesn't have the scientific evidence to back it up. But punctuated scientists would say, well, this proves it must be we're right because humans appeared so suddenly. However, for the theistic mind, it's divine intervention. So I'm with Wallace on that.
Right.
There is no scientific explanation yet.
That's an interesting. This raises for me that old thing of, I can imagine a lot of skeptics at this point saying, sounds like God of the gaps. Sounds like you're saying, here's something we can't explain. God must have done it. What's your view on that?
Can I just say one thing? No, it's not a God of the gaps. It's not a God of the gaps because God, obviously, natural selection does everything. Did everything. It's kind of a God of a huge evolutionary transition, not a God of the gaps.
What's your take on all of this, Andrew?
That's right. Well, evolution does happen in fits and starts, as well as it can happen gradually as well. And one thing that was going on at that time was the human brain was increasing in volume. There was a moment where it doubled during in the evolutionary the timeline.
In a relatively short space of time.
Yes. Yeah. Now, I just wondered whether you could maybe have a tipping point there for that. Just suddenly, the brain, you suddenly had a critical mass for consciousness to be able to take place. Whereas, so it could be just, you could be looking at a fairly simple step in evolution, but you just get to that point where
and
you
suddenly,
suddenly,
you hit the magic kind of
right.
Well, what I would just say there is, from Homo erectus on, the brain was getting bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. That marks out all the hominid species.
Yes.
And Homo heidelbergensis was, they're kind of thinking a different name for that, but anyway, it got bigger. But the point is, Neanderthals had actually bigger brains than us. But they didn't have our cognitional abilities.
And how do we know that? Is that simply through looking at the fossil record and what we see of their culture?
Yes,
they weren't using tools or art or culture in the same
they were
way?
very smart. I mean, they were smart, but not the way we are.
Okay.
I mean, but like they... we for a long time shared the same tool technology as them. We even coexisted in caves with them. Some people would say we learnt the Acheulean tools and from them, the Mousterian from them. But then all of a sudden there was this explosion where then we, you know what we're like. They were always inventing things. Nothing ever stays the same. We're always, when we got our ability, that suddenly started happening. So the point is, what even paleoanthropologists would say, that it's something who are atheists, they'd say it's not the size of the brain, it's something to do with the inner wiring of the brain.
Well, that's
we
right.
had a bigger cerebellum.
Yes.
But
yes.
Could I?
I want to hear
Okay.
back from Andrew, because I know this ties in with the subject you're obviously working on at the moment, which is consciousness.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's not just the size of the brain as well. It's the way the brain is wired up. So maybe there was a difference between modern humans and Neanderthals in the wiring of the brain that just made consciousness, gave a boost to consciousness in the modern humans.
And that would have explained that leap in terms of cognition, social ability, culture.
That's right. Yes. Maybe the brain. You could. If you ran evolution again and again, you'd produce different things, and maybe there was just one of those routes just turned out to produce a brain that was more. It was better to evolve consciousness.
Okay, could I just say two things here? One, if you read, for example, Noam Chomsky, who's a brilliant, he's a brilliant linguist, and he's gone into evolution. Now he thinks that because of the structure of language, it couldn't have evolved. Like language is the thing that really separates us. It was,
Yes.
The symbolic capacity and so on. So he reckons that's the basis of the cognitive the revolution. But he said because of the way it is, he's gone into a lot of detail. Because I won't go into, but because of the structure of language and it's a universal grammar. He said it couldn't have evolved gradually. It just couldn't have. So he, being an atheist, says one individual, there might have been a mutation in one individual, and then it would have increased his fitness to such an extent that he had loads of children. So he says it happened, but that it was a sudden mutation. Now, the point is, again, I would say as a theist, a sudden mutation, but you can't really say what it is. That to me would be divine intervention at that point.
I mean, it sounds like you're saying you're not denying the natural process, if you like, that might be behind this, but you believe it's consistent with a pattern that fits a theistic account of how humans came to be.
And could I just say something else? In my book, I allow for a gradualistic thing, and that that it could have happened gradually. The big issue in the book, the main issue for me, is the evolution of evil, because that's the real challenge. You see, I'm from the Roman Catholic tradition, and in my tradition, we accept evolution and like that the Genesis account has a mythological dimension, and that like Genesis tells us that we have a creator who had purpose and who loves us, but science tells us how it happens. As Galileo said, I would go along with him. The Bible tells us how to get to heaven, but not how the heavens go. Right? So, but the point is, what made Darwin lose his faith was the evolution of evil, and that if it was inevitable, that how could we have an all-loving, all-powerful God? Now, you see, the interesting thing is I deal with a lot of evangelicals who are, young earth creationists and so on. But the point is, what you're saying, and I would totally agree with you, it's quite easy to reconcile creation with evolution. The real problem is evil.
Well, let's come on to that next.
That's a problem mainly for the denominations that actually accept evolution.
Right. Yeah. Well, we'll come back to this. Okay. We're just approaching the end of our first part already, and we've got both the accounts, at least to some level. I do want to get into a bit more how it maps onto the Genesis story of
Could I just say
creation
one
of all.
thing?
Yeah.
I do believe, my own thing is that there was divine intervention, but I think that there was divine intervention. I would agree with Wallace, and I think everything is supporting that.
Well,
however, it is still possible, of course, that a gradualistic explanation will be found.
I'd be fascinated to hear what Andrew has to say in response in the next part of the programme. We're going to take a quick break. We're talking about human evolution. Does it match the story of Genesis? Two fascinating individuals, Andrew Parker and Niamh Middleton, join me on the show today, and we'll be back in a short moment's time.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.
Welcome back to the show. We're asking today, does the story of human evolution match the story of Genesis? Again, I'm just going to say this at the outset. There's going to be many listeners who are saying, oh, Justin, why are we even assuming that the story of evolution is true to start with? Well, we do those debates frequently on the show. Today, we're kind of saying, okay, let's just assume that the evolutionary story is a given. What would it look like? How would evolution then match up with the story of Genesis if we gave that? Well, my two guests on the show today, Niamh Middleton and Andrew Parker, have both given really interesting different accounts of different parts of the evolutionary story and how they map onto Genesis. Niamh Middleton's new book is called Homo Lapsus: Sin, Evolution, and the God Who is Love. And we're going to pick up that issue of evil as well, because it's a really important part of the story. Andrew, fascinating stuff from Niamh there in that last section about the way in which she conceives this leap in cognitive ability, art, culture, and so on, suggests that some kind of God thing happened at that point. I mean, what for you as a scientist who doesn't have any particular religious commitments, how do you respond to that when you hear God sort of being brought in some explanatory way into a scientific story?
So I think some of these these ideas of divine intervention can be explained away by leaps in evolution. You can get some dramatic changes in a very short amount of time, as we've seen even in the Cambrian period, where different groups of animals evolved because a small mutation led to a massive change in body plans. But it's still an interesting explanation as well, and I think that putting these two together will help us to make ground in the debate.
I was going to ask as well, given that interesting difference that Niamh elucidated there between the way Darwin and Wallace had very different reactions to seeing the evolutionary story and what it said about God. For you, has it ever kind of made you think, looking at this record, it's very hard to see that a God of love would allow this sort of way of things happening, or is it the opposite, that you see, actually maybe that is the way a God would
No, that's right, absolutely. And I think for me, it's one of the problems. If there is a God, what sort of form does it take? Mm-hmm. How closely associated with individuals is it? Mm-hmm. If it's so closely associated, why can we have evil and all the bad things that are going on in the world? So, is it a more distant God that oversees things?
Kind of a deist God who sets things off in motion but leaves them to their own devices.
Yes. So, but then there's, I'm quite receptive to the idea of spirituality. I think that spirituality does exist. The question is, did it evolve or was it God-given? And especially...
Are the two mutually exclusive? I mean, because a lot of people I meet would say, well, it may have evolved, but that doesn't mean it wasn't God-given. There's a sense in which God is using an evolutionary process.
God is overseeing evolution, almost, yes.
Does that?
Yes.
Do you not quite buy that kind of way of thinking of the way God might act in the world through an evolutionary process, or do you think?
Well, it is. I mean, that's why I remain as sort of unsure, really, about this whole thing, because if you could have a better idea of what God is supposed to be. You might be able to make more sense of it, but because you're so far off that condition, it's probably best to keep an open mind.
Well, okay. Something that's already been brought up there by Andrew is this issue of evil, and the fact that and I've heard many Christians say who do doubt the evolutionary record, and perhaps this has been in a similar way to it was with Darwin, a stumbling block for them. A process that is so wasteful in a sense, where which means species come and go, and a lot of suffering and so on in the evolutionary record. Would a good God use that process to bring about these human beings? And this is at the centre of your book, isn't it?
Well, there are two types of evil, natural evil and moral evil. Now, the kind of evil you're mentioning there is natural evil. And it was both natural evil and moral evil that put Darwin off, because there's a lot of physical suffering in the world, and his own daughter, his favourite child, died, and that kind of, But he also felt if there was really design in the world, in the creature that you would most expect it in us, sentient creatures, there's no evidence of design in the moral sense, that they were evil. So as regards the process of evolution, right, okay, in our tradition, in Roman Catholicism, and in Christianity generally, it's believed if there hadn't been a fall, then there wouldn't have been physical suffering through a combination of divine providence and a superior intelligence. Now, as regards the process of evolution, well, what you have to remember is that that other creatures don't have conscience. They don't have to fear, or they don't, they don't have consciousness, or they don't have sentience like we do. So they wouldn't have the same kind of suffering that we would have. Now, it is believed that in our tradition that that if there hadn't been a fall, that we wouldn't have suffered. We, in Catholicism, we do believe nature, that wouldn't apply to nature. There would have been predatoriness in nature, and the same thing would have, that's Thomas Aquinas, by the way, this might interest you, was Darwin before Darwin. His theory of human nature was survival, reproduction and rationality and so on. Exactly. He was Darwin before Darwin was there. But so in our tradition, we accept that. Now, the question is, right, the question about natural and moral evil is, well, okay, God can foresee everything. So God knew there was going to be a fall. Even if we have free will and it didn't have to be like that, even if evil didn't have to evolve, God could foresee it would. So why did he go ahead? So what we would say there is that God did not will moral evil, that we had free will there. So that, the natural evil doesn't take away from the goodness of God, doesn't take away, because that's the process by which he created. That's the way the world evolved. That's, ecology. Like Wallace was a great ecologist, so he didn't have that problem with natural evil that Darwin had. So, but the point is, if moral evil was inevitable, then that makes God the author of evil by making us. He created natural selection, which created us. So that would make God the author of evil, and that would rule out an all good.
Yeah. So how do you square this circle when it comes to the way you see things having developed? Because from reading your book, it sounds like you introduce the idea of a fall into an otherwise benign human population, early human population, and to some extent you say, well, there was a choice in those early period of humans where, from what we see in the record, things could have gone in a very different direction to the greedy and competitive direction that they actually went. And for you, there's evidence there, presumably, that there was a sort of choice on the part of humans, rather like the Adam and Eve story, their choice to take the apple, eat it.
Well,
the fruit from the
that's
tree.
kind of metaphorical, yeah.
I mean, and this all ties in. I think we need to get to grips as well with the fact of how your evolutionary story maps onto that Genesis story of the fall as it's represented there.
Well, you see, interestingly, in recent times, neo-Darwinists like E.O. Wilson and Daniel Dennett and so on are saying things like, science can replace Christianity now. We can explain evil. And, philosophers like Michael Ruse are noting that the Darwinian account of human nature is practically identical to the Christian account as regards sin, how sin evolved, and particularly, although it also shows how altruism evolved, which is great. So they're saying, that they're, so I'm thinking, well, like, the only obstacle to complete integration is if it was inevitable, as neo-Darwinists think. Like they think, Freud and so Darwin, that there would have been an initial, once our rationality got to a certain level, there would have been a descent into anarchy. And then there would have been a reconstitution, of much harsher social structures. So did it have to be? Now, interestingly, Darwin himself said that the very first humans would have, when they had just barely achieved the rank of humanity, would have been lovely. they would have been, I mean, he describes them lyrically and poetically. To me, Darwin is a towering genius. And they would have been lovely. And in fact, what he was actually describing, but then once the rationality took full effect, we would have inevitably become, competitively aggressive and greedy and etc. and so on. But what he's actually describing, when I was reading that, that's original sin. He's describing a fall.
Right.
He just thought it had to happen.
A fall from a kind of perfect state almost
interestingly at the time, because the Lamarckian view, the progressive perfect, that we were progressing towards perfection, that was the dominant one, but natural selection took over. There were commentators at the time who actually preferred Darwin's, because it wasn't saying we were progressing towards perfection. It was saying that we were good and then we
fell
went
from
wrong.
perfection in that sense.
So the point is that, you see, I had to go into that because that is the challenge to the all-loving, all-good, all-powerful God. Was it inevitable? And so that's why I went into paleoanthropology and primatology and so on. And you can see that we were evolving towards the kingdom of God. That what Darwin said, would have been lovely, would have a lovely sense of responsibility. We would have been, very socially responsible and loving towards each other at that time. And then we should have become better and better and better. We should have been evolving,
But
and
things
instead of
took
that,
a
we
different
went.
turn.
Yeah. So when you look, that's one thing why I'm so interested in paleoanthropology. Like it's beginning to, it's looking very like, people who study Neanderthals kind of fall in love with them. They seem to have been so peaceful and loving and and unselfish. I mean, they looked after their elderly and their disabled and really, and they lived in small family groups. But they, the other hominids, don't forget, and this is what Harari points out. 70,000 years ago, we were just one hominid species among others, minding our own business in a corner of Africa, along with all the others.
Yeah.
Remember, we lived in harmony with the environment. We lived in harmony with all the other hominid species. From the time we got our cognitional abilities, we started wrecking the environment. Even when we went to Australia, things started going extinct.
Well,
we couldn't live in peace with each other, let alone any.
It's a fascinating way, because obviously this all plays into the way you see this record as mirroring, if you like, the biblical record
it screams
of a kind of perfect situation that is then there's this fall, sin, evil, and so on. Okay, I mean, you're not a theologian, Andrew. You haven't come here with that hat on, but I do find it interesting parallels between this story and the story that you sketched out in your own book of ways in which the evolutionary story could match some kind of a biblical story of what's your view on this? Does it make sense to say yes, this could reflect a kind of a biblical view of the nature of humans and the way things were and the way things fell?
I mean, it does, yes, but at the same time, I'm wondering whether you need that the religious account to explain what did happen. Really, is that? I mean, as far as I can see, that it can all be explained by science.
But could I just say, you see, maybe, but then it's a problem for Christianity. You see, it's a problem for as a Christian.
Yes.
You have to hope that it wasn't inevitable. I mean,
yes.
The evidence for me when I look at it indicates to me that it would be much more likely that we would.
But finish the thought there,
but do you actually need that? I mean, to have Christianity, do you really need to find a place for intervention somewhere in that story?
Okay.
Or can you have that story and can you have the parallel story of a God going alongside? In that, so you could have had this situation where there was a God in the beginning that sowed the seeds for whatever happened, and then allowed life to unravel the way it did. And using science, we can then explain all of that.
Well, science can explain it, yeah.
Yes. But then you can have your religion could be based on that original moments where some kind of deity became involved.
Well, it's the whole thing. It's just the real question is: did it have to be that way, or did we have free will? Did we have choice? Now, put it this way: there's a very famous theologian called Johann Baptist Metz, and as he has said, like after the Holocaust, all theology is theodicy. Theodicy is the problem of evil. The problem of evil in theology refers to how can we reconcile evil with the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God. And evolution seems to be showing, well, this is the way we evolved, and that's the way it is. So, for a Christian, now, there's another, Teilhard de Chardin, who's a Roman Catholic theologian. He was a paleontologist, and he said that he has integrated in a different way. He has said that evil is an inevitable byproduct of evolution, and that he was Lamarckian, that we are evolving towards perfection, and that paradise is at the end rather than the beginning of time, and that the second coming of Christ, that we're evolving towards that. But the problem with that is it doesn't tackle the problem of evil. Scientific evidence doesn't support it, because we're obviously clearly not evolving towards perfection, and also it diminishes the significance of the cross. I mean, Jesus dying on the cross means nothing.
I mean, obviously you're not approaching this from a Christian perspective to start with, Andrew, but I'd be interested to know from your perspective whether these overlaps that Niamh obviously sees in this story make sense for you. Is it? I mean, you've said of the chapter 1, if you like, and the evolution of these different parts fitting these days of creation quite well. Well, is it just a coincidence, or could it be that there's some kind of interesting guiding hand at work somewhere that these people managed to get it right, basically?
That's right.
The history of Earth. And I wonder whether there's a similar case here, whether Niamh's put enough evidence on the table for you to say, well, actually, there is an interesting overlap here between the evolutionary history of humans and the Christian idea of creation,
there is, yes.
Adam and Eve, fall, and so on.
Yes, for me, what I find interesting is the we knew the account of science from the scientific evidence, and that's solid. It just so happened that there was an interesting parallel in the Bible, and the same as Niamh has found with a different period of time. Now, does that provide evidence for religion, or does it? It might be that everything can be explained with science. We have that. That's perfectly fine. It's interesting that the writers of the Bible have managed to come up with a similar story without that evidence. That's interesting. We can leave science alone there, but there might be two ways of explaining all of this. But maybe ultimately, to have that belief in religion, you need to have faith somewhere. You need to add faith to the equation. And maybe the evidence alone that you can produce to say that this story can be explained with religion, you need to go a step further than that and actually have faith, because it can also be explained with science.
Before you come back in, Niamh, I do want to sort of, I'd just be interested in teasing out from you, Andrew, as you've looked at the development of early life in the record, and then human life going further on. Do you feel like a purely naturalistic explanation is enough, or do you feel, no, as some have said, that something different goes on when consciousness develops, that there is a sort of a divine spark of some sort that can't simply be explained by purely, if you like, naturalistic processes? Or do you feel that as a scientist you're not in a position to make those kinds of judgments?
No, because actually this is a really interesting period, because consciousness might be something that's a little bit different. We don't have a good scientific explanation for it at the moment, but if we extrapolate science and the scientific method, it does indicate that we will get there. We might not just have had enough time at the moment. So that's one way of approaching it. So just because science hasn't provided the answer yet doesn't mean that it's not going to in the future.
Is it your feeling that the God hypothesis must always be kept in that sense separate from a scientific account? Are you a bit nervous of what Niamh's doing in terms of saying it looks as though God did something at this point in the human species, and that this makes sense of the...
No, I'm not nervous at all. I mean, I think it's at the moment I see it as an alternative view. So, for example, with spirituality itself, I mean, is this something that was did it evolve, say, with early humans to get through an ice age or something like that? Spirituality gave them the will to be able to carry on in adversity, or was it God-given? So in a similar way, at the moment, I'm just not quite sure. And
do you recognise that, my final question before I come back to you, Niamh,
yes.
the account that Niamh gives of an early period in human history, which was relatively benign, and there was this kind of almost almost in a paradise sort of trust and empathy and familiar relationships before it all went wrong, as those cognitive abilities developed and suddenly they were used in the wrong way. I mean, Niamh is saying it looks rather like the fall. Do you recognise that this is kind of that it was the fall from paradise rather than the opposite way around when it comes to the
it does, yes. That story is quite convincing, I would say.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, Niamh, there's lots we could talk about, but specifically, the problem of evil is one that you feel your thesis deals with. So explain that, because at one level, the reality of evil is something we all experience. You seem to be saying that when we look back at those early humans, there was this point at which they had a choice to make at some level. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, evolution, genetics, they just take the course they'll take. There's no real free will involved. But you think that actually those early humans, there were choices that they could make, whether to continue in this benign form of humanity or to take a different path.
Yes, I think that they definitely had choice. The question is, again, what happened? But when what we're saying, like the fact that, it's such a coincidence that the two accounts are so alike, right? Now, at the moment, with the neo-Darwinist, it's saying, well, it was inevitable that evil would evolve. However, when you then check the evidence and you find that it wasn't inevitable, what's happening then is, rather than contradicting theology, rather than contradicting Christianity, it's actually supporting it. If science actually, when I look at showing that the evolution of evil was unnecessary and unlikely, so in that sense, science is actually providing empirical support for a doctrine of revelation. And just a little bit of philosophy here. Have you heard of Thomas Kuhn, the great philosopher of science? Well, you see, when you bring the two of them together then in that way, they fit together like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle to give a hugely expanded picture of human nature and human reality.
Give us the background to that. What did Kuhn say that you feel makes sense of this?
Well, okay, why was Darwinism accepted? Because it brings together every branch. That's one of the reasons why natural selection has withstood every challenge. It's one of the oldest unfalsified theories in science. It's a fact now, because it brings together every branch of biology. It brings everything together, and geology and all the load of subdisciplines of science. It brings everything together, that for Kuhn, for fertility, if a particular theory brings all these other different disciplines together, then that's a sign that it's true. Now, Darwinism has now reached out beyond science into psychology, and that's another thing you see that that Harari wants. He thinks that the wall between biology and psychology and law and university has to come down. I'd say also theology, right? But it's now reaching also into theology. And, William Whewell said, only the greatest theories in science, when different disciplines jump together, some completely different ones, it's a sign that the theory is right. So in Kuhnian terms, the fact that it integrates theology so well and confirms it would be a sign that natural selection is the main mechanism of evolution, and there was a fall. In Kuhnian terms, when things come together like that, it's a sign of truth.
That's an interesting one, because what you seem to be saying there is the fact that we recognise there's this moral dimension to humans, and that we've had this both the Christian and the biological record seem to be giving the same sort of story, essentially, effectively is a marker of truth that they both coalesce and they both kind of are different sides of the same coin to some extent. But that's a really interesting perspective. I mean, I know many Christians who would significantly disagree with you, obviously, because they have concerns over the evolutionary story itself as an adequate explanation of things. But given that you do take that view, it's a remarkable sort of way of trying to effectively bring them together. And for you, presumably, this effectively solves the long-running sort of battle between evolution, creation, and God. Because for you, it's simply saying we've been given a story that makes sense of the scientific story at a kind of spiritual, theological level.
Yes, and could I just throw in a bit of theology here? Like, what actually happened, okay? What was, to me, right, it seems obvious that the first humans decided they wanted to go their own way, and they didn't want God telling them what to do, that they thought they were God, right? That Adam, okay, that they wanted to be God, and they went their own way. Which is what, you know, Genesis, that disobedience is they thought they knew better, and they wanted to know everything God knew. Now the interesting thing is, if you think the concept of Jesus as the second Adam, that's another thing. Everything Jesus did his whole life shows how you reverse all that. I mean, as St. Paul said, Jesus did not account equality with God as something to be taken advantage of. He humbled himself to be born in a stable, to live the life, you know, a humble life, and to death on a cross. So if you think of Adam, I mean, you think of Jesus in the Roman Empire, he was God, but like the Roman Empire with the emperor was, you know, if you think of Jesus, he goes that way, he comes down, but Adam went up. And everything, Jesus' whole way of life, his whole ministry and his whole behaviour shows how it should be reversed.
Right, that's an interesting point. I mean, we're getting into quite, you know, interesting theological waters at this point.
Yes, that's theological waters, sorry.
But that's fine, and that's partly what the show is about, is trying to bring these two streams together. Anything you want to say before we go to our final break and we pick up the final parts of this conversation?
I mean, you know, what I'm thinking here at the moment is that if you know, we have these two accounts, you have a religious one and a scientific one, and the scientific evidence fits okay with both of them.
Yes.
Then how can we what can we use religion for now? How do we use religion, and what if you know the accounts of religion seem credible, then where do we use those now in our future? How do we solve some of the problems we have today?
Great question.
Can we go to that question after a break? Because I fear we'll be over time, but it's a great place to start to draw the thoughts of our conversation together. Excuse my very croaky voice. My own evolution has not developed to the point where I can cast off a cold very quickly, but it's good to be here moderating this conversation between my guests Andrew Parker and Niamh Middleton, and we'll finish off our conversation on the other side of a short break.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Brierley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Welcome back to the final part of today's discussion. We've been talking about the story of Genesis and the story of human evolution. My two guests, Andrew Parker and Niamh Middleton, have both produced books which, in different ways, map the story of the history of Earth, evolution, the human species, onto the biblical record, if you like, of what that looked like. And it's just been a fascinating discussion because you've both quite different, actually. Niamh, obviously, you're a very committed Christian. Andrew, you're an agnostic, but you're both willing to recognise that the religious story seems to have some relevance to the evolutionary record. I think we got to an important place, though, at the end of that last section, which was you simply asking Andrew if there is this consonance between the two stories, if you like, of explaining the human condition. How does it help us? I mean, this, for you, I'm sure, what we haven't mentioned perhaps at this point is that you're quite involved actually in using those technologies in ways that could help humanity in its future and so on. You're interested in using the principles that we find in nature and how we might use them to create a better world for us around ourselves.
That's right. No, absolutely. So, you know, there are practical things we can do which we use science for. How to create new materials that can replace plastics and so on. So I'm wondering, you know, what can we gain from the Bible or from religion that can help us and can convince humans to act in different ways to what we've been doing up till now.
Yeah, and this is sort of where the person who sort of inspired your book, Yuval Noah Harari, lands with his book Homo Deus. Is he recognises the problems that exist, and his question is, can our evolutionary past help our evolutionary future as we meet those problems?
Well, one of the things that Harari points out is that even though in the Western world we have the highest standard of living, you know, because that's where science is at its peak, and you know where we, you know, modern science developed in the Christian West. But I mean, as he says, we have much higher levels of depression. We have the highest levels of depression because we've lost a lot of the human You know, we're living in isolated groups. We're living in you know, in urban areas. The state is getting too much power. Families used to sort things out before, but I mean, his fear is of losing the human touch. Now, the thing is, right, when you look back at the way we evolved, okay, you can, and to understand this in a Christian context, this is what I do. Think of the kingdom of God, and think of the Jesus always used his favourite parable were about banquets, based on Isaiah's parable of the banquet at the end of time, where God would dry the tears on all faces. There would be peace in the world. Everybody would have a place at the table, so everybody would have enough food to eat, and also everybody's included. No loneliness, nobody left out. Everybody. So you know, this is kind of a vision of what the good life is. Like that's a big difference between Judeo-Christianity and Islam too, and say Eastern religions, that we believe life is good and is there to be enjoyed, and we all should be. As a priest once said to me, God made enough in the world for every man's need, but not enough for every man's greed. So the point is, Jesus was very convivial himself. Like there's no coincidence that he instituted the Eucharist. The Last Supper was everything happened at a meal, and he was called a glutton and a drunkard because he loved conviviality, right? So he used this banquet, the banquet etiquette of Jesus. He used a lot of parables, all based on Isaiah. Now, if you look back, I've traced this back, right, from Homo erectus on. It looks like the way the teeth got smaller. It looks like even they could cook million years ago. So you can imagine sitting around. If that was what distinguished us from like our closest other relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos and gorilla. You know,
it was the social aspect of
the
eating
social
together,
aspect of around the fire, and probably begin. You know, and then that where you can imagine a conviviality in the other hominid species, which then came to its peak in us, because then we were probably sitting around the fire telling stories to each other and, you know, bonding to it should make us even more social than we are, right? You know, that whole sort of thing, you know, it's still one of the things of life that we all love, right? Now, you see, what the Bible tells, you see, this is again, something like what you'd be saying to me, it's as if the Bible was only waiting for science to get to this point where we can, and this is what Harari is saying, with all this technological thing that we're capable of, that it could go one way or the other, you know, but we mustn't lose the human. What the Bible is telling us, and evolution is telling us, millions of years of evolution is telling us, that what makes human beings happy is very simple. That no matter how complicated and fantastic technology becomes, human needs are simple. We like conviviality, we like the company of each other, we like to be in each other's company, we like to be included, we like to have friends, and we like to have the good things of life. We all should have, if you think of Isaiah, he's talking about the finest of wines and foods. Isaiah was obviously cultured and a bit of a connoisseur. The kind of society he's talking about, everybody would be well educated, would know the finer foods and wines, and everybody is included. So you see, it's very simple.
Yeah,
what makes us happy?
It's
very simple, and we mustn't lose that vision. So what we need for science, to me, my view is, what we need for guiding science is the vision of the kingdom of God, and that will bring the best out of science and solve all the problems we have. And like science can cure.
Well, this
hunger
is
and all
often
that.
what people say, Andrew, is that science needs the guiding hand of the ethics of religion and philosophy and so on, in order so that it doesn't simply run off in whatever direction it happens to take, you know, increasing technology, but with those potential, you know, harmful side effects of people actually losing community.
One other thing quickly.
Okay.
Yeah. Like you have people like Daniel Dennett and Owls and so on saying, we can solve regression with genetic engineering and prosthetic means. Can you imagine what would happen then? You'd have scientists deciding what's good and evil. I mean, if you take out one thing, you could take out the lot. But genetic engineering, to me, would lead to absolute horror.
But is there a practical way to use religion to solve the problems? You know, not
the moral problems.
Yes. So not just highlighting the morality and what we've done wrong. And what's the cause of the problems, but is there actually a solution?
You mean to evil now, or to moral evil?
To evil, really, and the problems that we have in the world today.
I mean, I suppose my question to you, Andrew, would be, if you're someone who sort of obviously sees the benefits that science and technology can bring us,
as I do too, as we do, yes.
I suppose the question is there a guiding principle to how we use those things, though, in the sense that I think what Niamh seems to be saying is, religion has the capacity to show us the vision of what that life should look like, and if what our technology is doing is not helping us in that direction, then we need to reconsider. I mean,
yes.
What do you
so
make of that?
so what I'm saying, I suppose, is how do we combine religion with the advances that we're having in science to achieve a better result overall?
Well, I mean, to me, okay, the conviviality and including everybody and everybody, that's going to take moral effort. Like, to me, that's where we need the guidance of the New Testament. We need the guidance of Jesus. We need the guidance of Jesus. Like, it's very simple. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love your neighbour as yourself. Think about it. If everybody did that, we wouldn't have any of the big problems of society. So, you have to attack it root and branch, And then as well as that, I mean, okay, put it this way, in our tradition, it's believed that at the beginning, that we would have been much cleverer, we would have been much more intelligent, that God gave us physical powers. For example, that there wouldn't have been any death. Not that we would have been immortal, but that instead of going through physical death, we would have made a transition to a higher form of existence. You wouldn't have to go to, like the resurrection shows that, what the body, the spiritual body. Now, Jesus went through death because he had to go through our experience, but that we wouldn't have had to go through physical death, and we would have been much brainier, and we would have been much more physical. So science, I mean, to be honest with you, I wouldn't have any objection to science enhancing intelligence. But I would have an objection to it trying to enhance morality, because I believe, as Jesus said, the truth of existence, the moral truth, and the truth of the kingdom of God, if you continue in my words, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So you have to follow he can't write it down and tell, you have to follow in his example. So we need Christianity.
Okay.
Yes. No, I think it is morality where religion can play a big part here.
It's morality.
Really.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes.
And keeping morality under control, almost. Regulating morality.
I suppose my question sometimes in all of this is, and we had quite an interesting similar discussion earlier this year between Brett Weinstein, who's an evolutionary biologist, and Alistair McGrath, who's a theologian with an interest in evolution. And a lot of what came out of that was the question of what do we need to do to stop ourselves essentially destroying ourselves? Is there still a place for religion in our rapidly changing culture and society, technology and so on, that is still useful, if you like, for the future? And Brett's view was actually our development now has sort of outpaced the usefulness of our of what religion gave us in the past, and we need new tools and new ways of thinking in order to meet those challenges. And one of the things that Alistair pushed back with is, well, this sin problem, this idea that we are somehow inherently unable to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps because we've got this natural propensity for greed and selfishness and competitiveness, that's not going to be simply solved by more technology or telling people to do better. There's a spiritual dimension to us which needs change, which needs to be. And I wonder what you make of that Andrew, as a scientist and someone interested in the theological questions. Do you feel like we can simply confront these problems, regardless of whether we believe in God or not? Or do you think the spiritual dimension of who we are has an implication for whether we will ever get there?
Yes.
And so
my personal feeling is now that maybe now is the time that we need some help from spirituality. So, for example, if you look at electronic screens of all descriptions, they've just accelerated off at a pace that we can't keep up with them, and have taken over. And we need something like some morality to step in here and influence people to stop people living on mobile phones 10 hours a day and so on, and which has destroyed the way humans evolved to be, existing in groups, etc. But what I'm really interested in is how can that be done? What are the practical ways of doing that? You can't just go on continuously telling people to go to church or preaching in the way that it has been. Then something needs to change there, and I think there is a big place for religion in this moment. But it
well,
needs
you
to be
see,
done.
that's why the kind of book you've written and the kind of book I've written are important, because, like religion has to show. We need to be able to convince scientists and the general public that science is actually supporting religion, and that religion should if religion wants to have a say in in morality and in the way technology should be used and how it can be used ethically, because of course just because you can do something doesn't mean you ought to do it, then we need to do the kind of thing that you and me are doing, which is to show that the science is actually supporting religion in ways, and that religion was actually there first. Remember, Genesis was there first, what you were saying, and what science is showing us now about the way we evolved, Christianity answers that as well. It tells us, and also tells us that Jesus shows us the way, the way to solve our moral problems. So what you need is a combination. It's just that I just don't think, right? I think that morality should not be left in the hands of scientists and politicians alone, and particularly that religion needs to have its. We need cooperation. The two need to cooperate to get the best result.
I think so.
And then you see, then you can urge people. You see, one of the reasons, and Wallace was on this, the rationalisation of Western consciousness by science. That's one of the reasons why, you know, people are shrugging off religion as folklore and fairy tales. I get that, that it's just a fairy tale. It's a, you know, so that's one of the reasons why people are turning away. But if you can show, revelation is actually a higher form of knowledge than science, because revelation was here first on a lot of things that we, and that science is actually confirming things that revelation was there with long before. Then people, because people just aren't going to be told, do this, do that, do the other. You have to be able to reason with them now.
It's such. I'm afraid time is beating us, folks. But it's been just a fascinating hour or so to spend with you both on these issues. Andrew, going away from this conversation, I mean, at any level, as you continue to explore and understand and research human beings and the evolutionary story behind us, has it led you to think any more that there might be a God or a spiritual dimension to us that we need to explore as we go forward in this story, or do you feel confident that the scientific account alone or the naturalistic account alone is enough for us to kind of understand who we are and what our place in this world is?
Well, I still think that the scientific account is enough to explain, but I'm not discounting religion as something that it can equally explain, and it is equally credible. But I mean, up to the point of consciousness evolving, that's when religion. There is possibly more to explore with religion, I think, in that moment. But for me, I think we're approaching a time where perhaps we do need to draw on spirituality. If it's something that we've evolved to be receptive to, then that doesn't really matter. We still need to understand what it is better, and apply the principles.
Niamh, thank you very much for joining me on the programme as well. Where can people find more about your book? You've got a website, I believe, with... Yeah,
I have a website. It's niamhmiddletonauthor.com. NIAMHMIDDLETON. Middleton is a good name to have in the UK at the moment.
Well, it is.
Niamh is a bit awkward.
Niamh is, of course, yes. I was mispronouncing it before we came on air. It's the Gaelic sort of pronunciation, but NIAMH is how the name is actually spelled. Fascinating book. I'd be really interested to see the responses it's getting from others in the theological and scientific community as it makes its way around. But I found it, just a really interesting thesis on how to connect the evolutionary history of humanity and the biblical record. Your book also, Andrew, is fascinating in that respect with regard to the first chapter of Genesis. But for the moment, thank you both for being on the show today, and all the very best.
Thank you very much.
We enjoyed it.